Hello adventurers, and welcome back to DM Speaks. I am DM Lee, and in this new series called A Whole New World, we are going to go over building your own homebrew content. What that entails from the ground up, starting with the basics of world building and going on from there. Everybody has their own introduction to the concept of a fantasy world. For me, it was The Hobbit. Specifically this copy of The Hobbit. This was my childhood edition. You can tell that I loved it so much that I taped with packing tape the cover back on. There are pages falling out of it. It's beautiful, and it's like my child, even though it taught me to grow up. In The Hobbit, you'll find these two awesome maps at the beginning of the book. They're filled with awesome details, like here was Girion, Lord and Dale, and here's the gateway of the Long Lake. What The Hobbit did for me wasn't just the narrative of the adventures of Bilbo Baggins. It was creating this world that I could live in, that was full of details like the Misty Mountains and Mirkwood, and here was Girion, Lord in the Dale. It raised questions like, what is a dale? I was 7. I still actually don't really know the definition of dale. Most of all, these maps created a world that breathed and grew and had grown. It seemed to create this world that existed before the narrative had begun and would exist after the narrative had finished. The Hobbit's maps introduced me, as I'm sure it introduced some of you, to the concept of a world that existed that was like our own, that was just as weathered. My goal for this series is to give you as a dungeon master the tools to create a world that is evocative to your players as The Hobbit was to me. Later on down the line, we'll go over the story side of things and history and how to integrate new elements mechanically, but for now, I just want to go over the basics of world building, where I start when I'm creating a new setting. First things first, let's establish our terminology. What is world building? I'm going to throw a high concept term at you. World building is verisimilitude. This isn't as hard an idea as it seems from the number of syllables, but verisimilitude is the concept of creating something that seems true. With world building, you are trying to achieve truth seeming. I have written down here, truthitude. The goal in world building is to make your world seem as much like the real world as possible, or at least as much like a real world as possible. If I was to summarize it in one sentence, it would be this. Your world should follow the rules that you set to it, whatever those rules happen to be. That's it. You can turn off the video. That's all you need to know. Haha, JK, don't turn off the video. Subscribe, please. That would be rad. Thank you. So let's back up a bit and get into the history of some of the worlds that have already been built for Dungeons & Dragons. When Dungeons & Dragons began, it was played significantly differently than how we play it today. At the beginning, Dungeons & Dragons was little more than a series of unconnected dungeons, where you started at the front door and ended at the treasure. These dungeons didn't really have much in the way of connective tissue. You basically just went from one to the other without any sense of narrative or greater context for where these existed, or what they meant in a broader world sense. Ultimately, however, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson began to create a world through play that they would later call Greyhawk. Greyhawk was a grimmer setting than Dungeons & Dragons now takes place in, but has a lot of the same biological makeup. Much like the current Dungeons & Dragons setting, it's something of a standard high fantasy world. Magic is real, elves and dwarves exist alongside dragons and orcs, all of that standard sword and sorcery rigmarole. The current setting used by Wizards of the Coast for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is the Forgotten Realms. You've probably heard of some element of the Forgotten Realms already. It's where Icewind Dale is, and the city of Waterdeep, and Neverwinter. All of these familiar locations that have been featured in novels and video games and supplemental material, they all take place in the Forgotten Realms. The Forgotten Realms was designed to give a context for the adventures, and you can see that in much of its makeup. Through play, Gygax, Arneson, and later Ed Greenwood would create the context for the dungeons that they were playing through. It was a way to connect the story and give meaning to the players' adventures and give a greater context for what they were establishing. The reason I bring this up is that early Dungeons & Dragons players seem to be missing something. They seem to be hungry for some setting and some greater context for the adventures that were taking place within it. In other words, with a world, the players were able to see themselves more as their characters. They were able to experience their adventures in a more realistic way. They were able, in other words, to achieve a greater level of verisimilitude. So how do you, as a first-time world builder, achieve verisimilitude? This is a massive question that a whole bunch of people who are a lot smarter than me have spilled countless gallons of ink on, but I've come up with a pretty good list of what I usually start with in world building. First of all, I like to start with a concept. This is going to be the hook and the tone of my world. Next up, I decide on a thematic palette, which is more of the type of things I'm going to include. And of course, no world building would be complete without the environment, or the stage your players are going to play on. After this, I like to figure out the tech level and the material facts of my world, along with the supernatural and how that plays into the existence of the world on a whole. And finally, I like to come up with one central starting location, the home base. So, let's start at the very beginning. What is your concept? A concept in world building is the central hook, the thing that you really find interesting. For example, in the Curse of Strahd supplement for 5th edition, the hook is fantasy gothic horror. Strahd came from the Ravenloft setting, which was a bunch of people getting together and deciding that they liked the spooky stuff more. And I tend to agree. I love that spooky stuff. When I played Strahd, somebody left me a message in severed fingers, and that was awesome. Your concept or hook can be anything. For example, Dragonlance has the concept dragons. You can look at any piece of media and pull the central concept out of it. For example, on my bookshelf over there, I have The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is one of my favorite series of the past few years, and that concept is holy crap volcanoes. Your concept should be something like the central driving conceit of your world. The thing that you find most intriguing. Anytime during the world building process when you have to choose between two things, choose the one that goes closer to your concept. Likewise, this dovetails with the idea of tone. Tone in your game is like the emotional concept. For example, in a property like Game of Thrones, the tone is very grim and very dark and very serious. No one is safe. Everyone can die and can remain dead. Or not, I guess. That happens later. Spoilers. But the tone is like deciding your campaign world is going to be grim and gritty, like Game of Thrones. Or silly and satirical, like Terry Pratchett's Discworld. This will help you decide the type of stories that you are going to present to your players. In your setting, the tone has a lot to do with what you'll include. A dark foreboding castle doesn't play as well in a satirical comedy setting as it would in a setting like Ravenloft. So we have a concept and we have a tone. Next up, we're going to ask ourselves, what is our thematic palette? Think of it kind of like the colors on an artist's thing. Palette? Yeah, it's a palette, right? The thing they stick their thumb through. This is a little bit of a wibbly concept, but it's pretty easy to grasp once you kind of wrap your mind around it. A thematic palette is the spectrum of elements that you are going to include in the playset of your world. Familiar concepts, physical elements, character archetypes, even literal color schemes, all of this stuff fits under the umbrella of thematic palette. You can look at any given property and pull out its thematic palette pretty easily. For example, Mad Max is kind of a post-apocalyptic Burning Man aesthetic. Lots of spikes and fire and gasoline. H.P. Lovecraft wouldn't be complete without jazz-era America and tentacles. Anything in the high fantasy setting of the Forgotten Realms will include swords and sorcery. If this feels like a bit of a shortcut, it is. But that's okay. It's a shortcut that everybody uses. Take, for example, The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. It's an excellent heist-based, city-centered story. If I was to choose a thematic palette, it would be something like Waterdeep. Choosing the right thematic palette can make the unique things that you're bringing to your setting that much more apparent. Variations and unique elements like the glass towers in Scott Lynch's novel are much more apparent against the backdrop of this thematic palette. Likewise, a thematic palette will help you fill out the details of your world without putting in so much work. It'll help you give a starting point for the stories that you'll tell and the adventures that your players will go on. For example, a heist won't happen in Icewind Dale, or if it does, it might need a good reason for doing so. Come to think of it, a heist in Icewind Dale would be a pretty cool story. Speaking of Icewind Dale, The next element you'll want to think about is the terrain for your setting. This is the start of so many parts of your world building. A good terrain means that you have a physical location to anchor all of the events of your story. It can emphasize what you want your world to feel like more than anything else. For example, does your setting exist in a series of sun-drenched islands, or does it exist in a foreboding range of dark mountains? The terrain can help establish your setting like nothing else, and the more thought you give to how it looks and how it feels, the better off you'll be. Ask yourself questions like, what kind of rocks are there? What do they look like? Are they sharp and jagged, or are they soft and weathered? What kind of weather is it? Is it often rainy, or is it sunny, or is it wind-blown? Is it hot or cold? This is a good place to start playing around with juxtaposing different... No, I don't want to use concepts like just... I already used verisimilitude. I can't use juxtapose. This is a great place to start playing around with putting different elements that shouldn't fit together. Like, is there a horror campaign that starts in a sun-drenched chain of islands? Is there a city heist that happens in a mountain range? The terrain gives your players a stage on which to play out the actions of the campaign. Don't neglect it. Don't you dare. Don't you dare, Mr. Frodo, Sam. I don't know that line. Location can reinforce the themes of your world, emphasize your setting, and make all of this stick like nothing else can. I recommend having a really good feel for what it is to live in your world. How wet it is and how cold, or how dry and how hot. On a more practical gameplay level, you have the question of technology. This is a stand-in for so many other questions about world building, but on a practical gameplay level, this is a matter of what your players have available to them. For example, does your world include gunpowder? The Forgotten Realms setting kinda seems to be stuck in a perpetual high medieval setting, just right before the advent of gunpowder and overseas travel, but never quite reaching that. So ask yourself, does your world have machinery? Does it have gunpowder? How easily can your players access this stuff? Can they travel great distances without too much difficulty? Or are they stuck in one place until they get up the resources to get out? Tech level can describe so many different things about your setting, but a good way to start thinking about it is what era of human history would it be roughly analogous to? For example, the high fantasy setting of the Forgotten Realms is like the medieval ages. Or you could set it in something like the Age of Exploration with muskets and sailboats. Or if it's more of a steampunk setting, go for the Industrial Revolution. The opposite side of this coin is the supernatural. Ask yourself, does your world have magic? Like the technology question, this opens up a whole can of worms on world building. But for now, just consider the idea that your world might or might not have the supernatural in it. And this'll look different depending on how your players can engage with it. Is magic mundane and commonplace? Do people use cantrips to repair clothing and to feed chickens? Or is magic something a little more rare and exotic, and maybe dangerous and considered threatening? Or is it completely legendary, spoken only of in children's stories or bards' songs? Dungeons & Dragons assumes that the players have access to magic. It assumes that magic exists in the reality that you're playing in. That's not to say that you can't have a world without magic, just that, mechanically speaking, magic exists. If you're using the Forgotten Realms setting, then it exists a whole bunch. Gods exist. They regularly interfere with the affairs of mortals. Monsters exist. They populate the dark corners of the world, and there's a reason that most people don't venture into these forgotten ruins. When you're world building, it's important to consider the supernatural, and the irregular, and the unknown. What is normal and what is magical in your world? Likewise, as kind of a final consideration for both the technology and the magic question, what do normal people think about these things? What I mean to say is, what do people consider everyday and mundane? This can tell you a lot about the existence of magic in your world and how easy or hard it is to access. Same thing with technology. This brings us to the final thing that I usually try to include when I'm building my world from the ground up. I like to include a Shire. Every new world needs a doorway into it. This is essential for players engaging with it for the first time. It's a way to introduce the players to the concepts of your world without overwhelming them with lore. It's a way for your players to get their toes wet without drowning. The home should be a mundane place. Think of it as the baseline for your world. Just a normal workaday village, or neighborhood, or cavern, I guess. Whatever it happens to be, this is where normal people live to do normal things, and there's something that demands that the adventurers take care of that normal status quo. The Shire should be a mundane place, a place with a status quo. It should be a way to introduce your characters to the bigger concepts of your world without overwhelming them with the details. It should be a place that your characters understand, more or less. This is the Shire, a place to start your adventure, a way to get your characters out the door and down the path. A way to get both your players and yourself to start exploring, figuring out what's over that next hill or what's down that river. What's in this deep, creepy hole in the ground that seems to be breathing? From here, what you can do is to continue to ask yourself questions. Like, what would the king think about this coven of druids that lives in the forest outside his castle walls? What color are the robes that evil-worshipping cult wears? Why are they blood red? Ask yourself, what happens when I put this next to this? That's what world building is just coming up with a baseline and seeing what reactions you get from putting the two things together. So there you go. That was a quick and dirty guide to world building. These are the things that I try to establish when I'm building my own settings from the ground up. You'll want a concept and a tone, a thematic palette, terrain and environment, tech level, and supernatural. Next episode, we're going to talk about populating your world, filling it with NPCs and monsters. Who lives in your world and what do they look like? What things do they use and interact with regularly? What do they think is scary? Ultimately, what stories will they tell and how will your players engage with them? But that's it for now. Until then, keep adventuring, and I hope you tell me what you come up with in the comments because I love hearing about new worlds. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you feel like it. Have a good day. DM Lee, signing out. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole, with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. I could have like an entire episode on how they... I think I might have that. That sounds fun. Would you guys like that? Hit subscribe if you want that. Message me if you want that. You can reach out to me on Twitter, or leave a comment below. Oh, sorry, The Hobbit. I just love The Hobbit. Okay, that's it. I'm gonna go now. Bye.